to you yesterday and again this morning about landscapes. The monument proclamation, both of them, talk about cultural landscapes. The references in the planning document we've been reviewing also talks about cultural landscapes, but it doesn't really say that the plan takes any stance on the preservation, the alteration, or the degradation of cultural landscapes. But to me, that's a key component of why the monument was established in the first place, and therefore should color the management perspectives of the monument. And I would like to know why it's not addressed in the cultural resource section. There's no active direction toward preservation or assessing or managing cultural landscapes. It's not in the recreation section where they talk about using certain sites, but it doesn't talk about impacts on a cultural landscape. It's not obvious in the visuals management section, and it's not in the livestock section, and livestock use is part of the historic component of the cultural landscape. So before we move off cultural resources, I need to be able to take back to my constituents some sort of sense about why cultural landscapes were addressed so briefly, if at all, in this plan. Or whether it was just something that you didn't have time to do and you're working on it behind the scenes or whatever it might be. Because it's a major component of cultural systems. And for example, Indian Creek. Indian Creek is a cultural landscape. It has a prehistoric component, it has a tribal component, it has a historic component. It does not include rock climbing, camping, and that sort of thing, which may or may not be intrusive, but until the issue of the landscape is addressed, we don't know that.
Terry?
We have engaged in ethnographic studies. Those are the documents we're working on that. I think we're trying to capture that further field for the landscape. You know, it's always a tough discussion in a federal document on like spiritual landscape, right? I mean, we have bureaucratic words for lots of things, but when you start getting to landscapes and spiritual landscapes and that, it becomes difficult for us because, you know, there are some tribes and some, for instance, that don't want to tell us about where some of these TCPs are. It's very intentional. We have tried to bridge that some. We have, our monument here, we actually have a tribal liaison. We hired a person specifically for that, so they can spend all of their time reaching out to the tribes and getting that relationship so that we can try to understand what that landscape is, because I think it will always be challenged to some degree to bring that into an allocation or a condition of approval in some mechanism. So I think we're making the efforts. We are working, continuing to work during all these comments periods on beefing up the language, and I think the MAC can certainly, you've identified that you feel like the landscapes have not been addressed adequately in the current document. So it's back to your recommendation that needs more attention before the final, and that would be appropriate for us to spend some more time and explain some of the other things that we have been doing to try to address that bigger concept.
Many times where we get feedback on this is through the 106 process and working with the tribes and the SHPO and trying to get some input at that point, and then on how do we address the potential effects on that landscape through that process, which is it's sort of like the endangered species. I mean, you have the ability to bring in then some recommendations through that process to make your product, your plan stand, as one that has officially addressed that issue and has reasonable and prudent alternatives, is what we have in the ESA.
I think that the concern is from the umbrella level, as you pointed out yesterday, Lance. This is kind of an allocation document, and if we don't adequately consider the cultural landscape within that allocation framework, it's too late by the time we get to the 106 section, by the time we get to the implementation level, because it needs to be upfront that this is an emphasis for some particular zone or special use area or whatever terminology the two agencies can agree on. And that's why my concern that it might not be adequately addressed at this point in the planning process, because it could end up with an allocation assignment, if you will.
One of the other things, and I had talked to Lance earlier about whether we should bring this up. I don't want to broaden it too big, but we have to take in context what this monument is in context of the surrounding landscape. We have 380,000 acres of WSA, protects a landscape. Arguably, and we've heard from other commenters that the way it's configured currently is that that's not big enough. That's not really the true landscape. Is much bigger. From the Chacoan experiences, the Chacoan landscape is New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, Colorado, very large. That's like, okay, I get that, but so when you're looking at this, I think we're limited in some sense by the boundary. That's what this plan is for specifically. But when you put it in context, I know that we have hundreds of thousands of acres of ACECs. We've closed many areas to mineral entry. We've done other things to protect a landscape, and this is a component in that landscape. So without adding the complexity of that context surrounding it, it is hard to have a conversation about landscape when it's a 200,000 acre landscape without getting it running down rabbit trails, I guess.
Yeah, it's like nested frequencies and range management challenge. But, maybe we're down to this level instead of that level, because I agree when you talk about Pueblo landscapes, from a land management standpoint, that's enough. But this is a confined area, and there are specific places within it that may be of concern. And I just don't see that that's been adequately addressed in the document. And I have no problem with the fact that you can't have it all, and there's multiple uses. But I think before an officer can make an informed decision, he or she has to have the data before her, and this plan is where that belongs.
And so can I take away from that, because again, I want to remind, this is a consensus group, and so recommendations be made on a consensus basis with full discussion. I have a recommendation that there be more specific language, more setting of context, more emphasis on the cultural landscapes as part of the EIS, as part of the information in there. Do you see anything in the alternatives that precludes that from happening at this point, or that's
Precludes it?
right, or is this more just the analysis itself? You would like to see more in the analysis?
Well, I think some of the, what do you guys call it on the chart? I think some of the affected environment and management constraints that are identified in these charts might be altered with a more in-depth analysis. So I see that there's a potential here for a little bit of a ripple effect. I don't see it as being major.
Is that something others in the group would like to engage in a recommendation on, or is that just something good for us to be aware of? I'm gonna be a little more proactive, and then you guys can tell me to stand down. But I'm gonna try and be a little more proactive in the facilitation, just for a little bit. We can try it, see if that helps keep us moving. But I don't want to rush discussion or cut it off. And if you sense that I am doing that, please bring me in.